You're attending the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research Forum. So thank you for making that on a bad hair day, at least for some of us. But, this is the seventh forum that we've held this year. And we have a couple more to go. But this one is especially, I think, timely and what the conversation is in our House, Senate, and even at the federal level. So I'm excited to bring these panelists to you today, two of whom are from MSU, and one is a close friend of MSU. We're going to take a look at corrections in the light of the recent passage of the federal First Step Act. Raise your hand if you know a little bit about the First Step Act. Anyone? Excellent, excellent. So our panelists will give an overview of the Act as well as the Michigan corrections system. We'll look at the implications of the Act on state corrections and finish up with the pros and cons of the Act, as well as we'll give you a quick glimpse of the objectives of the Act, preventing ex-offenders from returning to the correction system, and we'll also hint toward the economic impact of that in Michigan. So I want to give a special thanks to Professor Kennedy, Jay Kennedy, who brought this topic to the Institute and said, this conversation is going on right now, and we want to have it for our policymakers at the State House. So here we are. Jay Kennedy is an assistant professor, jointly appointed to the School of Criminal Justice and the Center for Anti-Counterfeiting and Product Protection at MSU. In his current role at MSU, I'm going to stop for a minute. Come on up. There's plenty of room. I feel kind of lonely up here in the front. You can come in this door if you like. Okay, thank you. In Dr. Kennedy's current role, he is actively involved in research, education, and outreach efforts, focusing on corporations, industry associations, and enforcement agencies. So his current research explores managerial responses to employee theft within small and medium businesses. He studies the incarceration and post-incarceration experiences of white-collar offenders. He also looks at the sale of counterfeit goods on the internet, pharmaceutical counterfeit schemes, and today he's stepping out a bit to give us a quick look at Michigan's correction system, and of course to welcome his colleague, Derek Cohen. I think they spent some college days together at the University of Cincinnati as they pursued their doctoral degree. Derek Cohen is the director of the Center for Effective Justice and Right on Crime at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So he's the one who's traveled the furthest to be here today, and we're glad you did. Both, as I mentioned, both Dr. Cohen and Dr. Kennedy attended the University of Cincinnati. Prior to joining the foundation, Dr. Cohen worked as a researcher with the University of Cincinnati's Institute of Crime Science. He also completed advanced trainings through the Consortium of Political and Social Research at the University of Michigan. Dr. Cohen contributed to the orchestration of the First Step Act, which is why we're here today, to talk a little bit more about that. Our opposing panelist has tremendous expertise gained from looking at corrections from the prisoner point of view. Jennifer Kovina is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at MSU. Her primary research focuses on prisoner reentry and the understanding of recidivism, or the return to the criminal system after one has actually served the time for original offense. In other words, repeat offenders. She studies desistance, as well as particularly she studies desistance, which is about the process of how one moves away from crime after they serve time. Pretty good? I'm sure she can tell you a little bit more about that, but it's an area that's we really want to pay close attention to. Why do people serve the time, and then they're released and they're able to move away from that system successfully. Her second area of research is centered on examining how gender and social circumstances impact victimization among minority youth, which would be, if we know more about that, we can do a lot more regarding prevention. So we're going to start off with Dr. Kennedy, and then Dr. Cohen is going to just come up right after his remarks, and then we'll finish with Jennifer Colina. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for coming. I greatly appreciate it. As Anne-Marie mentioned, corrections is not my primary area, right? So full disclosure, I do not study corrections as part of my primary research agenda. I focus on occupational and organizational crimes, what most people consider white collar and corporate crime. But when the news of the First Step Act started to roll out, I knew that this was an important aspect of correctional reform within the United States, even though it's occurring at the federal level, as we'll talk about their implications at the state level. And then when I found out that my good friend Derek Cohen was involved in it, I thought, oh, okay, so what mistake did we make? But more importantly, I thought, okay, here's an opportunity for us to bring someone in from the Michigan State University perspective to talk about how this can impact corrections policy and corrections research moving forward. And then reaching out to Anne-Marie, she offered this opportunity, which is very good. So thank you very much for joining us. So I mentioned, I study white-collar crime and organizational deviance, and why would corrections reform be a big issue for me? Because we incarcerate so few of these offenders. And the caveat to that is that, as was mentioned, a part of my research looks at the incarceration and post-incarceration experiences of white-collar offenders. And why this topic really became relevant to me is in completing a study, I wrapped up a study about 18 months ago with individuals who had been sentenced to federal correctional facilities for engaging in various white-collar crimes, embezzlement, fraud, Ponzi schemes, real estate fraud, things like that. And there were two primary themes that came out of that made me refocus and think about the impact and the importance.
Working for you.
Awesome, okay. Okay, so you know that. However, two primary themes that came out of my conversations with white-collar offenders that I thought was really, really important. And even though I kind of made these observations many, many months ago, hearing about the First Step Act brought back to me these 2 points in two very distinct ways, but I think are very important ways. And so the first point that came up was that the individuals with whom I was speaking face significant barriers with re-entering to society and being successful following their terms of incarceration. So let's be very clear, we're talking about individuals with very high levels of education. Most all of them had at least a bachelor degree. Many had masters. I had several doctors, PhDs and JDs in that sample as well. They all had vast business experience, skill sets that now are in demand by many employers today. They had very large personal and professional networks. They had great support systems, large incomes in a lot of ways, but they also had a felony. And that felony prohibited them from reintegrating in such a way that they felt they could be useful to society again. In many ways, it inhibited them from getting gainful employment. It fractured their social and their personal lives, and it left a lot of them with some traumatic experiences. It was interesting to note that several of them mentioned the mental health implications of incarceration, but most importantly, the fact that they were stigmatized going forward from that point following incarceration. And that concept in and of itself is not new. We know those things happen with quote-unquote traditional offenders who go to prison. But speaking with these offenders helped put it into a context that was really unique, because we're talking about people who are considered outsiders, right? They are not our traditional offenders. And if we have individuals who have significant advantages from a personal and a professional standpoint, if they have struggles getting back into the workforce, if they have struggles building their families again, supporting their families, what do people who do not have these support structures face? So I thought that was a very important question. The next thing that came out of this was that these individuals, their perceptions of the criminal justice system changed substantially. Most of them, before they went in, they said, you know what, I thought the people who were in prison deserved to be there, the correction system did a good job, everything's working fine. But then afterwards they said, I see the inefficiencies. I see the problems that are going on. And I had one guy say to me, I've got my degrees, I've got good family, I've got job skills. There are guys here that are getting released in a couple of months that have none of that. I know exactly what's going to happen to them. And a couple of interesting things happen. So one gentleman said, and this was with maybe about 5 or 6 individuals, I said, I found myself advocating for individuals in the system who did not have the same access that I did, and trying to find ways to support them so that when they got out, they wouldn't come right back into prison. The other thing that someone mentioned was the broader impacts of incarceration. So many ways we think an individual commits a crime, they go to prison, they serve their time, quote unquote, and they're done and they've paid their debt to society. But we forget all of the other individuals who are impacted by this, by incarceration. And so several of the offenders I spoke to said, it's had a personal impact on me and strained my relationships, but I look at these individuals who have spent 10, 15, 20 years in prison. They're in a federal prison camp because they're getting ready to be released. But what are they going back to? How can they support their families if they can't get gainful employment? They then become a burden not only on society, but on their families. And so the impacts are much more than just that individual, and they're very long lasting. And so this made me think, again, if this class of offenders is really picking it up, these privileged offenders, as we talk about, what does it say for the chance of successful reintegration and rehabilitation for other individuals? And before I had this question before the First Step Act came out, and I said, there are a ton of significant struggles they face. There's got to be something we can do about it. I didn't take it upon myself to do that, obviously. So when the First Step Act came out, when I first started reading about it, I said, this is a great thing, at least from the initial standpoint, to get the ball rolling. My concern was that it would die in Congress. That it's great rhetoric. Everyone wants to talk about the fact that we have a broken correction system, that we need to support these individuals, but where is the money behind the talk? Where is the actual work behind it? And when it passed, I was kind of dumbfounded, but I was also very happy to see that these things would be coming forward. And so just a brief overview of the First Step Act, if you're not familiar with it. It has 4 primary parts. I know Derek's going to dig into this a bit more. But the first one is about reducing recidivism. And so recidivism is that process of going back to prison once you've already been in. And I'll talk about this from the Michigan perspective in a little bit. But this is a hugely important problem, particularly when we talk about the fact that, as my white-collar offenders had mentioned, the individuals who are incarcerated currently, if they don't have the job set, if they've been out of the labor force for a number of years, if they don't have the education, how are they supposed to come out and be productive citizens in society? And so higher recidivism rates go along with that. The second one, storage or secure firearms, is the very smallest part. It's like 2 paragraphs in the act. And so, restraints on pregnant prisoners. Some of these things are just, you're like, duh, right? Why would we need to have something in there about not restraining pregnant prisoners? But obviously it identifies a gap. And this is an amendment to, I think that was part of an amendment to some existing laws, but the common sense approach, I think, is starting to come out. The miscellaneous criminal justice, don't let that title fool you. There's a lot of important things that are wrapped up in that fourth section. The top one, I think, is primarily important. The placement of prisoners close to their families. One of the things that came out of my research, and Dr. Kobina will probably be able to speak greater to this, I don't know if she will, but I know she has more information on this, is the impact of familial support while someone is incarcerated. Right? They don't go away just because they're in prison. And having sustained familial and social networks are vastly important to successful reintegration once they leave prison. And placing people closer to family means that people can visit more often. It's not as much of a financial burden on the family, and will reduce some of those larger social harms that come with incarceration. De-escalation training for law enforcement officers that are in Bureau of Prisons is important. The other thing that's really important is this fourth point, and there are more, but increasing funding for state and local government collaborations. And I think this is a really good jumping off point for transitioning what's being done at the federal level down to the state level. And thinking about how can these policies, how can this law start to guide some of the conversations that we have within Michigan, that occur in other states, around really good corrections reform. rehabilitating the system so that we can better rehabilitate individuals who are put into the system. Very important to point, the First Step Act is not a panacea, right? It does not give us complete solutions to our high incarceration rates. It will not totally alleviate the fact that we have significant needs for rehabilitation of offenders that are not being met. It will not fully eliminate our high recidivism rates, and it will not fully solve the issue of long-term desistance, so people staying out of crime long-term. But as the title points out, and as I'm sure Derek will state, this is a first step. And so I think we need to be very realistic that we can't eat the whole apple in one bite, but taking small chunks at a time is a proper way to move forward, at least if we are moving forward. And the impetus is, where are we going to move forward? Again, I think the First Step Act is a great roadmap. It can provide a starting point for what happens here in Michigan. How that happens, I'm not sure, but I think it's a good way to get us going. So why is it vitally important for Michigan to look at this? Between 2015 and 2016, from prisons just operated by the state in Michigan, there were over almost 28,000 people released from custody. So over those 2 years, 28,000 people leaving prison, going back into society, going back there maybe with familiar structure and support, with the same level of education for the most part that they went in with, but with larger gaps in employment and opportunities. At the end of 2016, there were 41,000 people in Michigan prisons. Now, I should say that's a reduction from the previous year. So Michigan has started to trend in some of the right ways, right? Our corrections population is shrinking, the number of people getting out is growing, but that also leads to additional issues, particularly when we talk about long-term desistance and recidivism. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, they did a study of 30 states, including Michigan, and this is why all of these things are really, really important. Of those 30 states, prisoners who were released from state prisons in 2005, 44% of them recidivated, were rearrested within 1 year of being released. Within 3 years, 60% were rearrested. Within 9 years, 83% of those individuals were rearrested. Now, there's two different ways you can frame that message. You can frame it as, these are really, the really bad people in society. They're the habitual criminals who are always committing crimes, so they deserve to be in prison. That's one way to look at it. I think that's kind of the traditional narrative. The other way to look at it is that I think we're missing an opportunity to provide these individuals who are being released from prison with a better chance of staying out of prison if, one, we can address the stigma of being incarcerated, but two, we can provide them with the support that they need to become productive, to remain productive citizens in society. And that relates back to the focus on rehabilitation, addressing their unique specific needs, which gets to one of the issues in the Act, or one of the titles in the Act, and then providing the services and the social support that make these things possible. If we don't take this approach, what we ultimately wind up with is a specific demographic, a specific group of individuals in the state who are consistently being reincarcerated. We wind up with that same prison population. And even if those numbers decrease, there's a concentrated number of individuals who, once they get into the system, they will likely remain in the system. And the question that we ultimately need to ask ourselves is this what we want out of society? Currently, in my estimation, this model is not only unsustainable financially, but it's unsustainable socially. Even though the prison population has declined, right, effective reentry and rehabilitation programs are really the key to keeping those formerly incarcerated persons out of prison and keeping them productive members in society. And so I will turn it over to Dr. Cohen, who's going to give a bit of a better overview of the First Step Act and his experiences in bringing it to fruition. Derek? That or you can yell.
Well, as Mrs. Kennedy said earlier, I think the microphone is not exactly necessary for me. So I would like to just start off a little bit by addressing some of the points that have already been made. And Jay, I don't disagree with anything that has been said up until this point. I just want to put a little more flavor on some of the reforms and kind of the perspective going forward from the state level. So one of Dr. Kennedy's points was, how can this reflect down to the states? And certainly there is an opportunity for increased federal, state, and local partnerships. But I'd also like to say that that kind of frames this in a way that puts the chicken before the egg. So if we look at criminal justice reform nationally, a lot of people are kind of surprised to hear that. One of the first states that enacted a wholesale criminal justice, and the first large state that did, is actually the state of Texas. In 2005, everything's bigger in Texas, so was our budget and capacity crisis. We were about 15,000 beds short, so we were over capacity by 50,000. This is after an entire decade of the 90s, where, as a bipartisan push, Governor Ann Richards and Governor George Bush basically went on a prison building spree, adding almost 100,000 prison beds to our state capacity. Think of that, 100,000 prison beds. Well, we got to a point in 2005 where not only did we have a problem getting the money out of the public fisc, we actually had a problem procuring the cement to build the facilities. We had procurement issues, not just issues paying for it. And so the Speaker of the House, Tom Craddock, basically said, think of a different way. We just can't do this anymore. And he had a new corrections chair, Jerry Madden, who was an engineer from West Point, and he basically saw everything as a bucket. How quick is the bucket getting filled? How quick are we draining the bucket? And how quickly are we using alternatives to putting water in that bucket? And so taking that perspective, one thing that he did was work on what's known as justice reinvestment. What that is simply taking that money earmarked to old brick and mortar facilities, actually building the facilities, and using a fraction of that money towards more efficient ends in the community, whether it's increasing substance abuse treatment capacity, whether it's increasing just good old-fashioned probation and parole, whatever the specific needs for that state are, being able to address that within the budget. And so that took off in Texas in 2007. Notice I said 2005 before. It was actually vetoed by Rick Perry the first time through, who now, Secretary Perry being one of the more vocal proponents of criminal justice reform. But then again, he also had interaction with the criminal justice system between now and then, Dr. Kennedy, on the white-collar side specifically. And so, going from there, it's what we see nationally is folks looking at Texas, looking at other states, Georgia, South Carolina, that have definitely taken this perspective shift and saying, hey, trust us. We did it here. We're closing facilities. Our recidivism's going down. Our crime rate's going. We all know that in aggregate crime rates are going down, but our crime rates are going down as fast or faster as places that haven't addressed these policies. And we generally see that the sky is not falling. That actually sets the groundwork for what we did at the federal level. Now, at the federal level, again, we like to think of the federal level as the bully pulpit, and the states can take the lead from that. But here, we definitely don't see that. We basically have, about 50 years worth of unilateral ratcheting in one direction. The only thing that we were able to do for 50 years in federal criminal justice was to get more punitive. And that's not to say that we didn't need to when we embarked on this. Back in the 1960s, there was a pronounced and palpable crime wave. The only arrows that we had in the quiver and the only tools that we had in the toolbox were incarceration. We did not have the state of art that we do in rehabilitation that we do today. We didn't have any proof of concept like we do with nuancing things with risk assessment or knowing what the effective treatment and rehabilitation looks like. All we knew is that people that committed a crime, did something bad, we want to stank our finger at them and show them how bad we are, and the only tool for doing so was increasing the length of time that they're going to be on the other side of brick and mortar. And so that was basically what we did for 50 years. So in other words, there was nothing but low-hanging fruit when the First Step Act finally came to be. And so we found ourselves in this position of, I call it Schrodinger's bill, because it's both it's a fairly tepid, modest criminal justice reform, and it's also the most significant criminal justice reform in a generation. Both are true at the same time. And so what does the First Step Act actually do? Now, Jay illustrated a lot of the banner level sections there. But I do want to point out that what this seeks to do, hard stop, is it does seek to bring down that recidivism rate. You mentioned rearrest 9 years on for 83% of individuals. Though I will say that cohort actually started before were doing this rehabilitation-oriented reinvestment policy. And so what we see is the states that tend to adopt these start to have more marginal declines. Now, of course, that doesn't get rid of this kind of persistent revolving door issue that Professor Kennedy pointed out. And so 83%, just think of it, if you're rearresting 83% of people that have been through your programs and through the system, that is a tragedy. That is saying, imagine if we built 83% of bridges here that failed within 10 years. 83% of bridges collapsed within 10 years. There would be a public outcry, and public servants would be going to jail for that. So that's kind of how we approach the criminal justice system now. And so what does the first step actually do? Well, the big thing is it brings the federal system in line with the states in terms of earned time credits. Now, this is a big confusion point, especially for many staffers on Capitol Hill. What earned time credits are? Earned time credits are time that you can earn in order to get to faster community corrections, whether it's home confinement or it's halfway house, whatever is most appropriate for the individual, allowing that credit to be earned through recidivism reducing programming. So in other words, taking the individual, giving them a carrot rather than a stick, and saying if you complete these programs, be they educational, work, voc ed, or even some that remove the actual barriers to rehabilitation, literacy programs, what have you, if you take this, you can earn a credit to be applied to your eligibility to segue back into the community. Now, that's good for certain low-level offenders, but how do we know who is a low-level offender or not? This is one of the sticking points. Well, we actually had to develop a risk assessment for that. A risk assessment then is still yet to be developed, but that risk assessment simply diagnoses who has access to this. Now, there are some hard factors involved, some static factors in terms of instant offense of incarceration, prior violent crime history, versus low-risk offenders. But I also want to point out that this also includes risk of reoffense too. So generally, if these items are taking hold, these rehabilitative-oriented programs are taking hold, we should actually see this individual coming out medium to low risk, where they'll be eligible to take advantage of that program. Contrast that with earned time credits, where as long as you wake up in a federal facility and don't stab anybody, you get credit for that day. And so that doesn't incentivize, don't get me wrong, while I think that it's a good transformer on the actual sentence length, that does not incentivize an inmate to actually take credit or to take the rehabilitation to their own hands. Jay mentioned the closer to home perspective. That is not a big thing in Michigan. It's not even a big thing in Texas, and we have a pretty large state. That is a huge thing across federal facilities nationally, where you can be sent to a place, as far as 2,000 miles away from your release county. What we did is basically cap. So there was Bureau of Prisons guidance that said, well, if you are within 500 meters or 500 miles as the crow flies, you're in good shape. We just simply transferred that to 500 miles driving distance. Not that big of a change in overall distances, unless there's a lot of right angles in the highways in your states, to be honest with you. But what it also included was guidance that says, periodically the Bureau of Prison needs to reevaluate where you are and segue you, space permitting, closer to the county of release. This allows people to better facilitate those familial connections we know that make people resilient when it comes to their reentry success. There was also an expansion of compassionate release. Essentially, I don't mean to be glib about this, but the way compassionate release worked at the federal level before, this is with folks who are terminal, and basically going to let them die at home. It was so strict before that essentially they basically rolled you to the door of the prison, dumped you, and then the funeral home came and picked you up, and that was considered compassionate release. So we really put some strength in there too. And Jay also mentioned the women's dignity part. That is something that we really see taking hold in the state. Is that going to reduce prison beds? No, but it really reifies the dignity of the incarcerated individual. And when it comes to not incarcerating, and it's not just women who are pregnant, it's women in labor. There was actually a space specifically in southern states where a lot of women were actually giving birth with shackles on, and that actually has led to some horrific incidents that have motivated why this is an important policy inclusion. But none of this actually will transform in the near term prison beds, especially if we have a while for that rehabilitation and prison component side to stick in. That's when things got interesting over in the Senate. So the prison component started off with Representative Doug Collins of Georgia, and he is now the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee. But he really took a look at what Texas did and what Senator Cornyn had been providing for. I think he ran the bill at least 2 Congresses before for the last 4 years, and said, you know what, Georgia did this, Texas did this just makes sense, I'm going to author it in the House. Similarly, we actually started to see the White House, the Office of the President, specifically down in the Office of American Innovation, really saying we are spending just at the federal level an awful lot on these programs. There's got to be an easier way to do this. What can we actually do to get more bang for our buck? And so those 2 things coalesced, and it actually was voted out of the House 360 to 59. And 57 of those 59, when we did the whip count, that were nays, basically said the bill doesn't go far enough. And on the prison side, I think that's a valid argument that you can make. The Senate didn't have such a compunction. They actually said, well, we've had SRCA, the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, we've had this here for at least 2 Congresses. We need some sentencing here or we're not going to move it. So keep in mind, this is the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Charles Grassley of Iowa, saying there needs to be more teeth in this bill or we're not moving it. And so that's when the 4 sentencing components were added. Those things were, 1, 924C stacking. Who's heard of 924C stacking? Oh, I figure you guys would all have read your code of federal 18 USC. But no, it's such an arcane issue, and this is exactly what the problem is with federal sentencing. 924C stacking is an enhancement that's worded in such a specific way that if you were to sell marijuana, and we're talking marijuana, we're talking personal use. If you if you were to sell that 3 times, and that you were alleged to have a gun in your general orbit, in the car, back home, whatever the case may be, that applies to you because that gun exists in furtherance of a criminal conspiracy to sell that personal use of marijuana 3 times. Out the gate, the absolute minimum you can get for a 924C stacked offense is 55 years with no parole, or with no release. 55 years. So, minor level street dealer, we all like to demagogues say we're talking about El Chapo here. No, we're talking about Weldon Angelos who sold little dime baggies of weed and owned a gun back home. And that's 924C stacking. We also had 841, 851. Those were your mandatory minimums that went 10 years, 25 years, or 15 years, 25 years life. Now those are knocked down to 5, 10, 25. And those are for the more higher level drug trafficking. Again, these are mandatory minimums. These are where the sentences start, not where they finish. And so we also did that. We expanded the safety valve. A safety valve is, say that you're running up against an 841, 851 mandatory minimum. You can basically say, look, I'm a very low-level person. I have all these mitigating factors. Should that not at least facilitate a downward departure? And that's what the safety valve does. And then most importantly, when it comes to actually having immediate appreciable results, in other words, people seeing relief from the First Step Act immediately, that is the Fair Sentencing Act retroactivity. So a lot of folks don't understand that back in 2010, they actually changed the calculation on how crack versus powder sentencing worked. It was at 100 to 1, so you could have 100 times the powder cocaine that you did to crack and receive the same sentence. And here's the interesting legislative history. This bill was actually authored by Jeff Sessions, brought that down to 18 to 1. Well, the problem with the 18 to 1 is that's only perspective from when it was passed in 2010. This basically goes back and applies that to the pre-2010 folks, the 18 to 1 threshold. And that is about, it's about 2,000 individuals, which 10 years hence, that's actually a lot, because a lot of these folks that are under that previous ratio have already aged out of or has already been released from prison. So this is what it does in entirety, but Jay was right, this is not a panacea, and it's really a modest reform. In fact, the First Step Act, and like all federal bills, it had the interesting acronym, First Step, like Federal Integrated Reentry, basically spelled something out. It wasn't until the final correspondence back to the House that it actually just said, okay, we're going to lowercase and just call it First Step so we don't sound like insane people. But it's really supposed to highlight the fact that this is going to be the first of many. And talks have already started about what the second step is going to look like. And that second step is going to be a very broad-based, I want to say, re-entry initiative. So this has to do with recidivism reduction. So I think a lot of the next step is going to be, okay, we're releasing these people through whatever mechanism it may be. What can we actually do? And so it's going to look at how does government get in the way of that? You know, twig card licensing. These are all things that the federal government does, not the state government, that actually directly bears on this. You know, it's not a huge deal in Michigan, but any of the Gulf states, Texas being one, twig cards are a huge re-entry thing. Twig cards basically are a credential to work in any sort of critical infrastructure. And as we know, if you have a federal drug offense, which you can get pretty easily, you know, that is wholesale disqualifying. So really, what can we do to streamline that better? And so that's what we're talking about right now. Again, I'm looking forward to seeing what's in the Second Step Act, but I think we're just kind of nascent in those discussions immediately. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Kobina, and I hope we didn't steal too much of the thunder talking about all the different moving parts of this.
All right, I want to thank everyone for being here. So as was mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the strengths and limitations of the First Step Act, because I do think it's important to look at how the provision of the Act and its effects may be beneficial or even detrimental. So obviously the first pro of the First Step Act is clearly it brings about criminal justice reform in federal prisons. So we know that reforms in the federal prisons and the sentencing system is really long overdue, as has already been mentioned. So the bill is a step in the right direction in bringing about criminal justice reform that will impact the lives of not only people who are incarcerated, but also their families. So the First Step Act is really consequential because it includes provisions for more meaningful sentencing reform, as has already been mentioned, which would reduce the amount of people who are incarcerated. Because we know that sentencing laws have really played a central role in increasing, which has led to mass imprisonment. So the federal prison population, for instance, has increased from approximately 25,000 in 1980 to now 190,000 individuals today, which is a 700% increase. So the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and federal spending on incarceration is approximately $80 billion. And the cost of the Federal Bureau of Prisons accounts for nearly a third of the Justice's discretionary budget. So federal incarceration has really become one of our nation's biggest expenditures. So criminal justice reform must have significant impact on the number of people who are entering prisons, but also the number of people who are to be released from prison. And so the bill attempts to get at this, and I'll discuss how in a minute. However, the limitation of this bill is that the provision of the Act is directed only at the federal prison system, which accounts for only a small proportion of those who are actually incarcerated. So as of 2016, approximately 190,000 people were incarcerated in federal prisons. In contrast, 730,000 are incarcerated in jails, and 1.5 million are incarcerated in prisons. So that means about 87% of those who are held in state correctional facilities are going to be completely unaffected by the Act. And so while the First Step Act does certainly attempt to chip away at the problems of mass incarceration, its overall impact is unlikely to be as large as some of us would like. And if we want to make any meaningful change in the criminal justice system, we have to seek reform at the state level. However, the other pro to the First Step Act is that front-end solutions are offered to reduce prison populations. So, as I mentioned, sentencing policies have really served as a leading contributor to the expansion of federal prison populations and the increased economic cost to our nation's budget. And so as Derek had mentioned, the front-end solutions are provided by reducing mandatory minimum sentences for those who commit serious drug offenses. So the 3 strikes mandatory penalty is reduced from life imprisonment to 25 years, and 20-year mandatory minimum is reduced to 15 years. And currently, the offense that triggers mandatory minimum sentences includes any prior drug felony. However, the First Step Act limits prior convictions to serious drug felonies which occurred within 15 years, and expands qualifying prior convictions to include serious violent felonies. So again, this is certainly a step in the right direction, especially since the U.S. Sentencing Commission found that mandatory minimum sentences disproportionately impacts communities of color, and particularly African Americans, in which they're likely to receive less relief from mandatory minimum sentences compared to whites and Hispanics and any other racial ethnic group. So as was already mentioned, with regards to the Fair Sentencing Act, the Fair Sentencing Act dropped the crack powder disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. However, it was not applied retroactively. And so the act that essentially was prospective only in that it applied only to people who were sentenced after the measure was enacted. And so consequently, you still had thousands of people languishing in prisons. And so what the First Step Act does is it allows the Fair Sentencing Act to be applied retroactively by petitioning for the last remaining crowd who's in the 100 to 1 group, which would ultimately affect approximately 2,600 federal people who are in federal prisons. The con, however, is that the front-end solutions certainly don't go far enough in reducing prison populations. So for instance, we know that judges are often required to serve excessive sentences at the urging of prosecutors or based on the quantity of drugs without any regard to extenuating circumstances or even analyzing an individual's role in the offense. And so restoring federal judicial discretion in drug cases by eliminating mandatory minimum sentences would ensure that defendants receive proportionate punishment, or at least punishment that's proportionate to the offense that they committed, and it would allow judges not to ignore culpability. But if that can't happen, then at a very minimum, the shortened mandatory sentences is not applied retroactively. So I'm aware that this was a huge sticking point for some law enforcement groups endorsing the First Step Act. But if we want to have fair, cost-effective system that actually reduces the prison population, attempts to shorten the time behind bars should be applied retroactively and would certainly impact thousands of people who are in the federal system. And I would say that more should be done to reduce the number of people who are in prison because currently the federal prison system operates at 14% above capacity, and it's higher for high and medium correctional institutions. Also, the inmate to correctional officer ratio is high at 8.9 to 1. And just to provide some context, in city and county jails, this ratio is 4 to 1. And so ultimately, the system is at an overcapacity, jeopardizing the safety of not only those who are incarcerated, but also the staff. The other pro to the act is that it does include some backdoor solutions to reduce the number of people who are in prison. And so in some cases, backdoor solutions are used by allowing individuals who are categorized as low risk or as having low needs. They can, as Derek had mentioned, they can accrue some time credit from 47 days per month to 55 days if they do engage in rehabilitative programming. And some can exchange those credits for early release into halfway houses or home confinement. And so this would certainly reduce the number of people who are incarcerated. And the change does apply retroactively, which would affect approximately 4,000 people. And again, it's certainly a step in the right direction. The con, however, is this really doesn't go far enough. So for instance, rather than offer a fixed number of days of time and credit that can be accumulated, there should be an opportunity to those who are incarcerated to gain additional time credit for each year in prison if they do engage in rehabilitative programs. For example, in Michigan, this is with regards to good time credit, but in Michigan, an individual who is incarcerated can earn 5 days for each month during the first and second year of his or her sentence. They can earn 6 days for each month during the 3rd and 4th years of imprisonment, but behaving well. And then they can obtain 7 days for each month during the 5th and 6th years, etc., etc. And so this would certainly create incentive for good behavior or for encouraging people to engage in rehabilitative programs while in custody. So even if incarcerated individuals seek these credits only so that they can be paroled, and they're not necessarily seeking these credits because of a desire for self-improvement, the effect would still be the same. And that is, it would result in fewer behavioral problems in prison. At least some people would benefit from program participation, and then it would also lead to a safer prison environment for the staff as well as those who are incarcerated. The other strength of the First Step Act is that significant support is provided for rehabilitation programs in prison to try to lower recidivism. So the centerpiece of the First Step Act is that it does incentivize and also provide opportunities for individuals who are in prison to participate in rehabilitative programs. And by doing so, again, as has been mentioned, people in prison can earn time credit and then cash in those credits for early release from prison, either into halfway houses or home confinement. And so by incentivizing individuals in prison to participate in rehabilitative programs, it really creates this win-win situation in that individuals who are incarcerated can develop the skills and training that they need for a more successful entry back into the community. It can also result in early release for those who are prepared. And then finally, we know that the prison system would save a good deal of money. And certainly save a great deal of money if, in the long run, those who are released do not to reoffend and return back to prison. And then ultimately, society benefits. We know that the vast majority of people, 95% of people who are incarcerated, will return back into the community. And so society does benefit when they are released back into the community and they've been rehabilitated, they've been received training, and they can now support themselves and their families upon release. However, the con is that in general, there are long wait lists to take part in prison programs because there are few programs, so rehabilitative programs that are offered in prison. Often the common misperception is that individuals who are in prison cannot be bothered by taking rehabilitative classes. However, in federal prisons and even in many states, there are long waiting lists for classes of any kind because of the scarcity of such classes. For instance, the waiting list for the Bureau of Prisons Literacy class or program alone is 16,000. And because of overcrowding and staff shortages, many programming staff are regularly required to supplement correctional officers' duties, which have resulted in fewer programming opportunities. And the staffing shortage may partly explain why the number of people completing GEDs has actually dropped by 59% between 2016 to 2017. And the last pro or strength of the act that I want to mention is that it does authorize $50 million a year over 5 years to support more vocational rehabilitative programs. And so this money has been authorized to carry out the bill's mandates to create risk assessment tools, to determine earned time credit eligibility, as well as expanding programming and community correction capacity, which is vital. However, the con is that the bill excludes thousands of people in prison from benefiting from the programming incentives that allow for earlier transition into community corrections. And so those who are convicted of the most serious offenses are the ones who are actually in greatest need of the rehabilitative programming. And the main incentive to participate in those programs is a chance to earn time credits, which the most serious offenders are ineligible to receive. And so this actually conflicts with research that demonstrates that prison programming and associated incentives are most cost-effective when provided to the high-risk groups. And so in order to successfully reform the federal prison system, it is important to adopt policies to reduce the prison population, which includes reducing the number of people who are going to prison in the first place, but also reducing the number of people who are incarcerated. But it also entails the need to invest in more correctional and programming staff, as well as fully funding programming for all incarcerated people. But I do want to switch gears and just talk a little bit about some of the prison population trends in Michigan. So as we can see here, again, we're going in the right direction, as Jay had mentioned. You know, the prison population has declined 20% from 2006 to 2016. In 2006, 51,000 people were incarcerated, and currently about 41,000 are incarcerated. There have been declines in index crime rates, including violent crime and property crime. There's been declines, a 23% decline in arrests since 2006 to 2016. There have been declines in prison commitments, 23% decline. In terms of discretionary moves to parole, we see that there's been a 17% increase in the number of people who've been on parole, but yet the number of people returning to prison for parole violations has declined by 41%. And in terms of downsizing, we see that closure and consolidations of more than 26 prison facilities and correctional camps. And so this has really resulted in $392 million in savings via closure and operating costs. So you might be wondering, how did Michigan do this? Since 2006, Michigan has engaged in a number of decarceration strategies to reduce their prison population. So one of the things they've done is increase the number of people who are on parole. So increased parole approval rates went from 47% in 2000 to 72% in 2016. And so this was done by temporarily increasing the number of parole board members in order to enable parole consideration of individuals who had served their minimum sentence for nonviolent crime. But it was also done by placing restrictions on further parole denials for this group, as long as risk assessment scorings did not reflect high risk. The other thing that Michigan did is they developed technical rule violators and reentry centers as an alternative to parole revocations and returns to prisons. So these reentry centers were used to house both parole violators as well as individuals who were approved for release. And so this served as a means to interrupt the cycle of behavior while at the same time remaining on parole and receiving additional programming and services. And so essentially 97% of those who were sent to reentry centers returned to community parole. And the reentry centers serve as a way to avoid costly as well as comparatively long additional time served in more expensive and less program-oriented prison facilities. And so as a result of both improved community reintegration outcomes, we see that returns to prison fell by 41% in 2016. And then the last thing that Michigan did was they had intensive reentry and in-reach programming in 2008, which adhered to the evidence-based practices of the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative. And so this doubled the average annual number of intensive reentry program graduates. And ultimately, the 3-year success rate with regards to the number of people who are on community supervision increased from 61% to 82%. So Michigan certainly is doing a good job in taking the lead in reducing the prison population. Again, certainly more can be done, but we are headed in the right direction. Thank you.
I like how that ended on a positive note. We're doing pretty well. Lots of questions from my end. Do we have questions here in the audience? We have about 20 minutes to just talk about this and go back and forth. Any discussion points you'd like to make? I have a question, and it's from, obviously, someone who's pretty novice, but in fact, almost a stranger to this, but what is good behavior? Credits for good behavior. What are some examples of good behavior?
Well, I know, can I speak at least at the federal level?
I said somewhat flippantly earlier that basically waking up and not stabbing somebody, there's actually a very wide berth in how that is. Good behavior outside of a specifically defined technical infraction within the facility, usually you get credit days for that. The only time that the more marginal cases are taken into account is when they're part of a bigger bucket substantiating, this person has been bringing contraband in at a large level, and then they tend to just throw the book at them. But to be honest with you, with the hearing structure, there's a lot of folks who just don't want, or a lot of wardens and deputy wardens who just don't want to go through the administrative headache because you have constitutional considerations when it comes to anything that you are due off your prison sentence versus any sort of arbitrary interruptions in that. And so it tends to be a headache for those outside of the slam dunk cases. And so that also kind of highlights the need to really delineate between good time credit and earned time credit. And earned time credit, that's the novel system here. Almost every state has some sort of good time credit. I'd say probably about 30% of states have some form of earned time credits. And those earned time credits are the ones, to Jennifer's point, that really help folks, incentivize and take ownership of their own rehabilitation. And so good time credits help. They help more at a population level, but they don't necessarily modulate the success outcome because there's no carrot versus a stick when it comes to recidivism programs.
Michigan now does require that you do not include your criminal record in your job application. If that is true, do we know what effect that has had in terms of employment opportunities, et cetera, for the ex-offender?
I think it would matter.
I got some bad news. And we see this general with kind of the campaign for fair chance hiring nationally, is post hoc studies on this have and when I say studies, I mean in the academic realm, not in the advocate realm, have generally produced a minimal to almost unmeasurable effect on the success rates for the applications for the justice involved. Conversely, specifically women and communities of color actually do have a measurable decrease in applications. And the reason why is, this is the disgusting part about humanity, is when when that information is kept from the hiring practice, even good information, even information dispositive of rehabilitation or non-criminal involvement at all, more pernicious biases take root and folks try to get around that in particular thing. And so that's why you actually see the success rates for more marginalized communities in aggregate actually decline when that happens.
There's actually studies that can show, for instance, I know banded box has really hit in many states, including Michigan. And certainly there's benefits to doing that, but the unintended consequence is that when this information is kept from employers, that even individuals, in this case, when we look at African Americans, if employers don't have access to that information, in general, African Americans, even those who do not have a criminal record, they tend to end up being drawing the short end of the stick in that employers are less likely to hire African Americans. Because they don't have the information, they're now assuming that if you are black, then you're likely to have a criminal record. I don't have access to it right away, but when there are spots in one's resume, they will assume that maybe one was behind bars. And so there is this unintended, unfortunate consequence to employers not having access to that information right away.
One of the other drawbacks to the Ban the Box initiative is that in many places, it's on that initial form. So you can't ask in that initial form, but prior to an offer being extended, you can ask. And at that point, that offer can then be rescinded. The other issue is, if you have someone who is on probation or parole, you now need to explain as the employee why you need to leave in the middle of the day to go see someone. And in essence, that becomes another way to weed individuals out of the system.
And all that to say that it's not that individual employers who wish to take this practice on themselves, specifically we see a lot of state governments doing it, when it fits within their hiring framework or the framework for that particular posting, it should not only be encouraged, we should celebrate it. The only problem is, the problem that we find is when you paint with such a broad brush, it's going to lead to those unintended consequences. So, we want less of a one-size-fits-all and more of a, what can we do to facilitate returning citizens to get that job instead of making it harder to employ folks who may or may not have a criminal record on the back end.
My question is, when I got out of prison, it's kind of a discussion, I guess you had said that the number, step 2 of maybe the next act that you guys bring would have something to do more with reintegration. And I got out of prison, I was kind of on my knuckles a little bit. I tried to get food stamps denied for life for a nonviolent drug offense. There's child molesters in prison that are going to get out and be able to get food stamps. I couldn't even get food stamps. I never carried a gun, never got caught with a gun, never made somebody buy my pot. But I can't even feed my kids if I didn't have a job today. The other thing is the store I owned, we accepted food stamps when we first started. When the federal government found out that I owned the joint, they took my license to accept food stamps. So I couldn't even provide for my family. Because I was a non-violent marijuana dealer in 2010, and I get out of prison. On my way home, once I get to Michigan, I passed by almost 60 to 50 dispensaries selling pot on the corner, and I just got released from federal prison. I couldn't see my son, it's not right, and then now I've been out of prison for a while. I'm making a little bit of money, and I've got 2 kids now. Looked into getting a life insurance policy, so if anything happens to me, I can leave something for my kids. Banned, for life. Nobody wants to deal with me, not because I hurt people or because I was doing things that could get me killed or crazy things like that, or I don't know, just literally because I have some felonies on my record. Not because I don't smoke pot now. I passed all the drug tests. I'm a healthy guy, I own a business, and they won't even touch me, man. They won't touch me at all, and I think that's just so unfair that. And then I personally know so many people getting out of prison and out right now, and they're in the same boat, right? And it's like nobody cares, nobody's doing nothing. And so I just wanted to maybe start that discussion. Maybe it's already started somewhere. And also you had made a point to say that the next step would maybe be some more reintegration things. Some of those things should be looked at and maybe brought to somebody's table who cares, because, I had a good business going. We was making $300,000 a year off EBT customers, and we were providing in a hood, in a ghetto area that a lot of people would say was a bad area. We provided fresh, hot food for these people that maybe they didn't have a stove on at home, man. You know what I'm saying? But instead of getting their kids a bag of chips with the EBT, here you go. They were able to get hot chicken, hot fish, and eat it at home with their kids at a real family meal. And they took that from us. So not only did they take that from us as profit to be able to employ more felons, to be able to touch the community that way, they also took away a nice place for a family to go and get a hot meal, and they stripped it, just like that, And so I just wanted to mention those things so people could understand what's really, some things that are really going on that aren't on paper.
Drug offenses are the one offense you don't want to commit because an individual is faced with so many barriers. That is, they're often banned from getting food stamps, banned from public housing, and a lot of my research focus on. It's unfortunate that a person's criminal record often becomes their master status. You can accomplish so much, and years down the line, it still keeps showing up. And I've often argued in my work, recidivism should not just be what we're looking at. That's one thing, but you cannot reoffend and yet still not be completely integrated back into the community.
Just the rest of my life.
Yeah. And I agree with you, because it's unfair. You've already paid your debt to society, and it is really important that we're looking at these reintegration factors, such as helping individuals who are released from prison try to secure housing, secure employment, connect with have pro-social relationships with family members. Research has shown even the importance of having supportive parole officers, and the reality is a person's criminal record should not be should not take master status, because we say they should pay their debt to society. They have, but we continuously say that no, your debt really has not been forgiven, and so that's unfortunate. But I know a lot of my research shows the importance of looking at these reintegration measures to ensure success, and recidivism in and of itself is not enough. We can't just be looking at that.
And I would only add, and I cannot wholeheartedly support more everything that Jennifer just said, because the collateral consequences and how we engender them are one of the biggest problems in there. I mean, we're putting our own barriers in the way of reentry. I mean, your story is a quintessential point. One thing I think that we need to do, and just from the conservative perspective, is keep in mind our federal criminal justice system. In Texas, we have about 1,500 crimes, right? That still seems like a lot. Federally, we have 4,500 crimes and 300,000 regulations that can land you in a federal prison. For everyone to know what that, like every one of those 300, and we're talking about ridiculous things like using the Smokey the Bear logo without permission. Things like that. Now, we have such a broad criminal justice system that is so far removed from the people. That's why the founders really had the police powers were reserved for the states. And not every state is going to get it right, but when it comes to reducing course and having these corrections to kind of get rid of some of the excesses, specifically the ones you identify, basically not having to go all the way to DC to fight. And so when we're talking about EBT, then you're talking about Farm Bill reauthorization. You're talking about all these classical congressional knockdown dragouts where there are well-funded lobbyists who really don't care about reentering citizens. And that's why having everything at the federal level, is really the wrong-headed way to go about prioritizing the criminal justice system. And that's why, Jennifer and Jay's point, they both made this point, is that the states need to be the ones to lead in the reform. And that would also mean just kind of getting the thumbprint of the federal government off criminal justice generally. There's transnational stuff they're going to need to deal with. There's trans-state stuff they're going to need to deal with. But saying that a drug offense committed wholly within one state is a federal issue is absolutely ridiculous.
I also want to say, too, I think also it's important when we start talking about the next step, we need to be bringing formerly incarcerated people to the table as well, right? It's one thing for myself and others, like as academics, to be speaking about it, but formerly incarcerated individuals who have directly experienced this, they have a whole lot to say and can also contribute to how we can come up with bills and laws that are actually going to help people.
One of the issues that we have, and Monica said it well, that you have apples and oranges when you're talking about the federal versus the state correction system, is the challenge with, as this gentleman was talking about, the difficulty with people getting into entrepreneurship even. We have tried to see if unions would be interested in providing apprenticeships for returning citizens maybe a year before they have release so that they could do work inside the facilities. And there have been barriers with the bargaining agreements. I don't know if you've had to deal with that and if you've been able to overcome some of those barriers. And the second thing is that I'm on the Offender Success Program, which used to be called MPRI. And one of the maybe a good effort, but not a best effort practice, was that they used to offer, maybe they still do, a $5,000 bond per individual as an incentive to employ. And that's just not enough. And I'm just wondering whether or not insurance bonding has been something that you've been able to overcome as well.
I'd actually like to take that in reverse order, because those are both really good points. Specifically when it comes to insurance and employability. One of the things that we've done in Texas, so what are the big barriers to reentry? I mean, we all know the list, but in every single way, no matter how you slice and dice it, you're always going to have employment, you're always going to have housing. Right, and not necessarily from a causal relationship all the time, but at least from a correlative relationship. So what we were seeing in Texas is that generally you have reticence from landlords and employers even if they weren't statutorily prohibited from hiring or renting to an individual with a criminal history, a felony criminal history, you'd say, oh, well, they face some sort of per se liability and it's hard to get insurance if this isn't already on the books. And that's true. So what we did in Texas is we actually created statutory civil indemnification for folks both who are leased to ex-offenders and folks who employ returning citizens. And so that was just one of the things. Now, has that been as universally uptake as we'd like? No, I mean, turning the Titanic takes a long time. But it at least takes one more arrow out of the quiver that they can say, well, I don't want to lease or hire these individuals because of the harm that it can have for my business. And that basically says that's no longer true. And again, I mean, we have a bigger problem of stigma, and that's an even tougher ship to turn. When it comes to the earned time credits, I wholly believe, and not everyone has the capacity for this, but I wholly believe that states should do everything they can, and when I say states, I do not mean the state, I mean states specifically, should do everything they can to get out of the way of private enterprise trying to help. For example, one of the things that we had to deal with, so we had a Republican-controlled House and Senate when the first step back went through. And one of the things we had to deal with was everybody loved faith-based programming. But guess who we couldn't actually get inside the facilities? Chaplains that aren't designated as actual chaplains in the Bureau of Prisons. So, and prison fellowship, angel, all these things, all these, not-for-profit, privately ran, don't get a dime of your tax dollars, things that can actually go in and start building those bridges with these people, not compulsory, but they have so they have that available. These people were actually barred from that. That was one of the things we've done well in Texas thus far, is we have basically almost no brush in the way of getting folks back in the facility, even folks with existing criminal histories themselves, getting them back in the facilities to be peer mentors, to be support, maybe chaplains themselves, to basically reach out to that community and then provide for that warm handoff when they get back. And so that's why we've seen the success of certain things in Texas, like the prison entrepreneurship program. Markedly low recidivism rates from this. Selection effect, yes. I always like to caution that people that join and then successfully complete that program are special types of individuals. But it just illustrates that having that plurality of programs that don't just check the is this a CBT box, is this a good practice box. Having more, and I would say free because it doesn't cost the state a dime. Having more options in that regard really increase successful outcomes, specifically to those that you ask.
One thing I'd like to add from the state's perspective when we want to talk about enhancing employment opportunities afterwards is states need to look at their licensing boards.
Absolutely.
Right? That is a substantial barrier to individuals who, prior to incarceration, were licensed and due to a crime, lost that license, even if that crime was not related to the offense. That is a substantial barrier. And so right from the bat, all of those licensing boards, any board, because the state controls every licensing board, right? Any of those boards has an opportunity to impact future employment opportunities for returning citizens.
Excellent point. Have you forgotten your question yet?
No.
I have a few people here.
In Michigan, there's been a lot of discussion by educators about this idea of reform, saying that there's an inequity in the amount of money per student, per pupil, depending on if you're in an affluent community versus if you're in a community like Detroit. So my question is, has there been any discussion, if we think about returning citizens coming back to Detroit versus some other area of the state, for example, has there been any discussion about the inequities or recognition or some idea about maybe we should be doing more for returning citizens depending on where they're returning to?
I haven't seen anything, but again, I'm not the expert. Anecdotally, one of the trends I've noticed with my specific research area, a lot of the offenders that I speak with are going back to either middle class, upper middle class, or affluent areas when they have those familial structures. And the inherent financial and social capital that exists in those neighborhoods are themselves a support structure. So I think that is an argument for saying, a disproportionate distribution of resources is not inherently a bad thing from a rehabilitation or reintegration standpoint. So considering what those personal and professional resources look like, I think is important in creating at least parity or a level playing field for individuals who are going into resource-deprived areas or such.
And I would just add to that, and Jay, I completely agree with everything you said about the occupational licensing. That's a whole other event. But one thing is, and to your point, that you definitely see not only disparity in per dollar for releasee, you also see more releasees coming from those communities as well and returning to them. So how do we get around this inherent inequity? Well, that big one I think is not the answer, but one of the contributing solutions would really be looking at the voc ed component and doing that in the facility, as opposed to trying to wait to somebody. And this is, we talked earlier about, this is the warm release versus cold release. Are we just shooting somebody out of a prison and hope they're caught by somebody in the community and reintegrated? Or do we actually have a process where there's a warm handoff and the skills and values that somebody has learned while incarcerated then have a more direct translation? So in other words, we're not trying to build the plane after it's already in the air. We already have that central component, whether it's occupational training, whether it's getting some of the educational barriers out of the way. That's been taken care of in this facility. Unfortunately, to Jennifer's point, that tends to be the last thing funded. I mean, we can't just, if the lights go out in the facility, there's not much we can do. So that's the first thing. But when it comes to things that are generally seen as public safety luxuries, which I would include vocational and educational training being one, wrongly so, but being one, I think that that's really where the opportunity is. Again, if you look at where the success and reinvestment happened, it's taking that money that we would have spent on the one side, spending it up front on this, and now we're just spending less money. So it's even for fiscal conservatives to win, it just requires a more holistic look at it from the get-go.
Hi, my question has to do, and I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this, kind of society's new pariah, the broad brush of the SO, sex offender designation, both state but especially also federal. Those who have studied the issue know, and we're not talking about the really serious predatory people, but the prisons now are really filling up with low-level, first-time child porn viewers, people who have not committed contact crimes. Is there anything, so they're kind of like replacing the crack cocaine people in the prisons. Does the First Step Act start any reforms in that area, and any federal movement on sex offender registry, reintegrating these folks, because they even have a much harder road to hoe of trying to reintegrate?
Again, I have to say, bad news to that is those folks are actually explicitly banned from cashing in the earned time credit. Now, they still have access to the rehabilitation programs, and I completely agree with you that they're kind of I guess we have to take a step back and look at the kind of the layperson's perspective, and by layperson I usually put politician with less understanding than that, of what the criminal justice system is supposed to do, and essentially they see it in a very retributive context. And here we have a system that expresses some collective moral opprobrium for some action that's been combined. Now, you illustrated with the beginning of your comment that what we consider to be a quote-unquote sex offender, there's no such thing as a sex offender taxonomy, because if somebody is drunk in public and pees on the side of a building versus someone that has committed a violent sexual assault on a child, there are states that make no substantive difference between those two. And so when we have I was talking to Jennifer last night by email about state predicate offenses. When these aggregate up into a federal sentencing instrument in terms of pre-existing criminal history, we don't know if it's the Ohio standard with the building side urination, or we don't know if it's more of a Florida or California standard that would actually delineate between the gravity of the offense. So unfortunately, that category of offense in and of itself was actually stricken from it. But I have to agree with Jennifer on this when she said, the biggest bang for the buck that you get is by making sure that you have not only rehabilitation for, but incentive to take that for the really high-risk populations. You're going to get more delta in your actual observed change. The problem is, and to say this cynically, there just wasn't the political appetite to do that on either side.
Emery, you've got it. Go ahead.
There's a movement now on exoneration, a program that would like to have legislation on exoneration after 10 years or whatever it is. They wipe out your record except for what the state keeps. What's the current situation on that?
Frank, it's called the Clean Slate Bill.
Well, I can only speak nationally, is that we generally see, so in Texas we don't have sealing, we have non-disclosure, which essentially is the same thing. But what we generally see, and this has to be underscored, is that if you look at the predictive validity of a criminal history, there's some, and that's what we see when it comes up to static factors and risk assessments. There's some, but as time goes on, as an individual keeps their nose clean, we generally see that predictive validity trail off, and to the point where, 10 years or so, somebody with a violent felony who's kept their nose clean for 10 years is statistically no more likely to commit a crime than anybody here in this room. And so I really think a smarter thought, and you mentioned the Clean Slate Bill, we saw it just go through in Pennsylvania, and that there's a larger push for this nationally. I think there's a lot more appetite for sealing versus expunction, just generally, especially when there's predicate state statutes that require, with no time limit, the use of a criminal history in order to actually calculate a sentence. Now, we get around that in Texas because it isn't something that usually shocks audiences there. We have 0 mandatory minimums in Texas. We are completely indeterminate, and we go straight to jury sentencing. So there's no 25-year escalator in anything that we do, but an essential part in having that available is available to the jury the individual's criminal history. And so non-disclosure keeps things from certain boards and entities, but not from others. And there's a problem in that, there's a problem in Excel, especially for lower level, non-predictive offenses. But it just tends to be one of those ones where I think the broader movement facilitates a more nuanced and in-depth conversation. And that's what we should be springing off of, not saying records are completely destroyed after 10 years or they're kept ad infinitum.
Additional questions? We have about 2 minutes. Well, I'd like to ask for a round of applause. Oh, but before we do that, we have a gentleman over here who always asks really tough questions. I'm just giving you a heads up.
Well, thank you, Emery. I wanted to ask you about relationships with gang involvement in the prisons, and also we talked a little bit about sexual intimidation and that type of assault, but also could you talk about people who are dealing with mental health issues in the prisons and what kinds of services are being provided? Because we hear stories on the outside of people who get AIDS when they're in prison, people who are sexually assaulted, people who are intimidated by gangs afterwards, even besides while in prison. What are the prison system doing to track some of that within the system?
I'd just say first and foremost, what you mentioned are all management issues and not necessarily statutory policy issues. That doesn't minimize their importance or the impetus to actually correct it. One thing I will point out is, so every state is under the federal PREA standards, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and that dictates the most coarse guardrails in actual conditions of confinement. What I generally see is, especially because if you look at California, you look at Texas, the issue of gangs pose a very pronounced management problem, to the point that we've actually, we can't just keep all the gangs separate in different facilities. What we need to do is actually provide a pathway to assistance from those gangs. And so that's why we actually have the gang renunciation program that really, it functions basically as a reentry program too, because these folks are going to have to take special considerations in reentry, to your very point. When it comes to mental health, that is the quintessential problem. It's actually felt a lot more acutely in jails than it is in prisons. And not only that, but most state prisons have the facilities, or at least the capacity, to have one dedicated mental health unit or a mental health caseload. The jails do not. The jails basically are just pill dispensaries, and some of those problems are kicked to the prison, some of them are kicked back to the street.
One question that has come up at the Institute when we announced this topic was the question of changing the age for adult sentencing, raising it to 18, whereas in Michigan currently it's at 17. Is that something you would feel comfortable in addressing? Is that something other states are doing, or where does Michigan stand on that?
Well, Michigan's one of the, I think, 6 states left that have not? 4. 4? Well, I can tell you at least one of the other ones is Texas. So, and so the problem that we have, and I'll keep this brief, is that we can all agree that, like, policy-wise, it's a winner. 17-year-olds are youth and are more appropriately treated in a juvenile justice system. The problem is specifically in Texas is the cost of transitioning that population from what is essentially an economy of scale, low-cost incarceration and probation system that the 17-year-olds are now involved in, to a high supervision, very high support and rehabilitation juvenile system. The costs have really blunted the effort for that. And again, we can also, and not only that, but specifically our facilities, our juvenile prisons right now. I mean, we had an article came out that we had a 6-day riot in one of them. If you're in a juvenile facility in Texas, I mean, these truly are the worst of the worst, and I don't like to say that in terms of children, because they are children. But as far as with the very concentrated behavioral health needs and everything like that, like we have, keeping these facilities under control is hard. And it's tough to justify the cost, and it's tough to justify transferring a whole age cohort into a system that's literally on fire. So that's where our problem is.
I mean, but I would argue that we need to increase the age so that 16 and 17-year-olds are not being transferred to adult courts, because again, there is scientific evidence that shows that adolescents' brains are not fully developed until their early 20s. And so, and interestingly enough, the U.S. Supreme Court relied on this evidence to bar juveniles from the death penalty. And so I think it really is problematic if we are going to waive or transfer youth to adult facilities. And in addition, the way we often treat those who are being waived to adult facilities is because we know when youth have contact with those who are older, those who are incarcerated and who are adults, it can result in physical or emotional harm. And so one common way prisons or jails deal with that is by isolating those who are minors, and ultimately we know that that only increases depression, can exacerbate mental health problems, and also increase the risks of suicide. And so I think it's so important to have programming and treatment and rehabilitative services in juvenile detention centers so that they are receiving the proper treatment, because you have to remember they are still minors, and yet the consequences that they are facing are not minor at all.
Well, I think that just by talking about your work and what you know has made a huge difference today. And everyone, Henry, your comments made a big difference here today. Got people thinking in different ways about the topic that the First Step prompts in Michigan. Everyone who had a question or a comment made a difference today in redirecting people's thoughts about the correction system and what we might do here in Michigan to create a model system. So all of you have a chance to do more as you walk out of here today. There were so many policy implications brought up. Those looking at state boards was one that just slapped me right in the face. And then the other was the mental health issues that can result from an experience of a correction system and how we might address that. So a number of things, and I'm sure that's true for you too. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your interest in this topic. I hope that you take this information back to your offices and start a discussion about it. We post our presentations to the IPPSR website. We also have filmed this thanks to Kenan and his work. His partnership with the forums. We're filming this today, so you're able to view it and even have other people take a look at it. It usually takes a week or two, so be patient with us. but we'll get it up for you on the website, and you'll be able to share it. There are a number of photographs taken during this time, and that's always fun to visit and take a look at. Next month's forum is going to be winter lake oil spills. So we're going to be talking about first ever research that's being done on in cold weather conditions, what happens to oil spills in cold weather conditions. Hasn't been looked at before, especially on lake surfaces such as the Great Lakes, we all dearly love. So if I could ask you to do a few things. One is to complete your evaluation, give us some ideas on topics that you are most interested in. I want to ask you to grab a cookie on the way out. And finally, please give a huge applause to our panelists today. You're dismissed, but welcome to hang.
Or emotional harm. And so one common way prisons or jails deal with that is by isolating those who are minors. And ultimately, we know that only increases depression, can exacerbate mental health problems, and also increase the risks of suicide. And so I think it's so important to have programming and treatment and rehabilitative services in juvenile detention centers so that they are receiving the proper treatment. Because we have to remember they are still minors, and yet the consequences that they are facing are not minor at all.
Well, I think that just by talking about your work and what you know has made a huge difference today. And everyone, Henry, your comments made a big difference here today. Got people thinking in different ways about the topic that the First Step prompts in Michigan. Everyone who had a question or a comment made a difference today in redirecting people's thoughts about the correction system and what we might do here in Michigan to create a model system. So all of you have a chance to do more as you walk out of here today. There were so many policy implications brought up. Those looking at state boards was one that just slapped me right in the face. And then the other was the mental health issues that can result from an experience of a correction system and how we might address that. So, a number of things, and I'm sure that's true for you too. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your interest in this topic. I hope that you take this information back to your offices and start a discussion about it. We post our presentations to the IPPSR website. We also have filmed this thanks to Kim and his work. His partnership with the forums. We're filming this today, so you're able to view it and even have other people take a look at it. It usually takes a week or two, so be patient with us. But we'll get it up for you on the website, and you'll be able to share it. There are a number of photographs taken during this time, and that's always fun to visit and take a look at. Next month's forum is going to be winter lake oil spills. So we're going to be talking about first ever research that's being done on in cold weather conditions, what happens to oil spills in cold weather conditions. Hasn't been looked at before, especially on lake surfaces such as the Great Lakes, we all dearly love. So if I could ask you to do a few things. One is to complete your evaluation, give us some ideas on topics that you are most interested in. I want to ask you to grab a cookie on the way out. And finally, please give a huge applause to our panelists today. You're dismissed, but welcome to hang.
Or emotional harm. And so one common way prisons or jails deal with that is by isolating those who are minors. And ultimately, we know that only increases depression, can exacerbate mental health problems, and also increase the risks of suicide. And so I think it's so important to have programming and treatment and rehabilitative services in juvenile detention centers so that they are receiving the proper treatment. Because you have to remember, they are still minors, and yet the consequences that they are facing are not minor at all.
Well, I think that just by talking about your work and what you know has made a huge difference today. And everyone, Henry, your comments made a big difference here today. Got people thinking in different ways about the topic that the First Step prompts in Michigan. Everyone who had a question or a comment made a difference today in redirecting people's thoughts about the correction system and what we might do here in Michigan to create a model system. So all of you have a chance to do more as you walk out of here today. There were so many policy implications brought up. Those looking at state boards was one that just slapped me right in the face. And then the other was the mental health issues that can result from an experience of a correction system and how we might address that. So, a number of things, and I'm sure that's true for you too. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your interest in this topic. I hope that you take this information back to your offices and start a discussion about it. We post our presentations to the IPPSR website. We also have filmed this thanks to Kim and his work. His partnership with the forums. We're filming this today, so you're able to view it and even have other people take a look at it. It usually takes a week or two, so be patient with us. But we'll get it up for you on the website, and you'll be able to share it. There are a number of photographs taken during this time, and that's always fun to visit and take a look at. Next month's forum is going to be winter lake oil spills. So we're going to be talking about first ever research that's being done on in cold weather conditions. What happens to oil spills in cold weather conditions hasn't been looked at before, especially on lake surfaces such as the Great Lakes, we all dearly love. So if I could ask you to do a few things. One is to complete your evaluation, give us some ideas on topics that you are most interested in. I want to ask you to grab a cookie on the way out. And finally, please give a huge applause to our panelists today. You're dismissed, but welcome to hang.
Or emotional harm. And so one common way prisons or jails deal with that is by isolating those who are minors. And ultimately, we know that only increases depression, can exacerbate mental health problems, and also increase the risks of suicide. And so I think it's so important to have programming and treatment and rehabilitative services in juvenile detention centers so that they are receiving the proper treatment. Because you have to remember, they are still minors, and yet the consequences that they are facing are not minor at all.
Well, I think that just by talking about your work and what you know has made a huge difference today. And everyone, Henry, your comments made a big difference here today. Got people thinking in different ways about the topic that the First Step prompts in Michigan. Everyone who had a question or a comment made a difference today in redirecting people's thoughts about the correction system and what we might do here in Michigan to create a model system. So all of you have a chance to do more as you walk out of here today. There were so many policy implications brought up. Those looking at state boards was one that just slapped me right in the face. And then the other was the mental health issues that can result from an experience of a correction system and how we might address that. So, a number of things, and I'm sure that's true for you too. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your interest in this topic. I hope that you take this information back to your offices and start a discussion about it. We post our presentations to the IPPSR website. We also have filmed this thanks to Kim and his work. His partnership with the forums. We're filming this today, so you're able to view it and even have other people take a look at it. It usually takes a week or two, so be patient with us. But we'll get it up for you on the website, and you'll be able to share it. There are a number of photographs taken during this time, and that's always fun to visit and take a look at. Next month's forum is going to be winter lake oil spills. So we're going to be talking about first ever research that's being done on in cold weather conditions. What happens to oil spills in cold weather conditions hasn't been looked at before, especially on lake surfaces such as the Great Lakes, we all dearly love. So if I could ask you to do a few things. One is to complete your evaluation, give us some ideas on topics that you are most interested in. I want to ask you to grab a cookie on the way out. And finally, please give a huge applause to our panelists today. You're dismissed, but welcome to hang.
Physical or emotional harm. And so one common way prisons or jails deal with that is by isolating those who are minors. And ultimately, we know that only increases depression, can exacerbate mental health problems, and also increase the risks of suicide. And so I think it's so important to have programming and treatment and rehabilitative services in juvenile detention centers so that they are receiving the proper treatment, because we have to remember they are still minors, and yet the consequences that they are facing are not minor at all.
Well, I think that just by talking about your work and what you know has made a huge difference today. And everyone, Henry, your comments made a big difference here today. Got people thinking in different ways about the topic that the First Step prompts in Michigan. Everyone who had a question or a comment made a difference today in redirecting people's thoughts about the correction system and what we might do here in Michigan to create a model system. So all of you have a chance to do more as you walk out of here today. There were so many policy implications brought up. Those looking at state boards was one that just slapped me right in the face. And then the other was the mental health issues that can result from an experience of a correction system and how we might address that. So a number of things, and I'm sure that's true for you too. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your interest in this topic. I hope that you take this information back to your offices and start a discussion about it. We post our presentations to the IPPSR website. We also have filmed this thanks to Kim and his work. His partnership with the forums. We're filming this today, so you're able to view it and even have other people take a look at it. It usually takes a week or two, so be patient with us. But we'll get it up for you on the website, and you'll be able to share it. There are a number of photographs taken during this time, and that's always fun to visit and take a look at. Next month's forum is going to be winter lake oil spills. So we're going to be talking about first ever research that's being done on in cold weather conditions. What happens to oil spills in cold weather conditions hasn't been looked at before, especially on lake surfaces such as the Great Lakes, we all dearly love. So if I could ask you to do a few things. One is to complete your evaluation, give us some ideas on topics that you are most interested in. I want to ask you to grab a cookie on the way out. And finally, please give a huge applause to our panelists today. You're dismissed, but welcome to hang.
Or emotional harm. And so one common way prisons or jails deal with that is by isolating those who are minors. And ultimately, we know that that only increases depression, can exacerbate mental health problems, and also increase the risks of suicide. And so I think it's so important to have programming and treatment and rehabilitative services in juvenile detention centers so that they are receiving the proper treatment. Because you have to remember, they are still minors, and yet the consequences that they are facing are not minor at all.
Well, I think that just by talking about your work and what you know has made a huge difference today. And everyone, Henry, your comments made a big difference here today. Got people thinking in different ways about the topic that the First Step prompts in Michigan. Everyone who had a question or a comment made a difference today in redirecting people's thoughts about the correction system and what we might do here in Michigan to create a model system. So all of you have a chance to do more as you walk out of here today. There were so many policy implications brought up. Those looking at state boards was one that just slapped me right in the face. And then the other was the mental health issues that can result from an experience of a correction system and how we might address that. So, a number of things, and I'm sure that's true for you too. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your interest in this topic. I hope that you take this information back to your offices and start a discussion about it. We post our presentations to the IPPSR website. We also have filmed this thanks to Kim and his work. His partnership with the forums. We're filming this today, so you're able to view it and even have other people take a look at it. It usually takes a week or two, so be patient with us. But we'll get it up for you on the website, and you'll be able to share it. There are a number of photographs taken during this time, and that's always fun to visit and take a look at. Next month's forum is going to be winter lake oil spills. So we're going to be talking about first ever research that's being done on in cold weather conditions. What happens to oil spills in cold weather conditions hasn't been looked at before, especially on lake surfaces such as the Great Lakes, we all dearly love. So if I could ask you to do a few things. One is to complete your evaluation, give us some ideas on topics that you are most interested in. I want to ask you to grab a cookie on the way out. And finally, please give a huge applause to our panelists today.